We are in week 3 of this 4-week study where we're talking about what it looks like to transform the heart of the city. If you're still with us, I want to applaud you and I want to thank you for being a part of this study, for taking this seriously. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked a question, and that question was, Pastor Scott, with all of this talk that you say and all of this talk that we hear about how God is calling us to transform the heart of the city, what does a transformed city look like? And I don't know if you've ever asked that question or wondered that question. When this question was asked of me, it forced me to really try and think about what this actually looks like. Like, what is and what does a transformed city look like? How do we know that we actually are transforming the heart of the city? We won't know until it is that we have an idea of what a transformed city looks like. For that, Scripture helps us. One of my favorite things in Scripture is that it begins in the country. One of the best things you read in Genesis that people take away is that you get this beautiful picture of a lush garden. You get fruit, you get trees, you get vines, you get flowers, you get everything that is right with the world. It's lush, it's fertile, it's fresh, it's heaven, it's paradise. The author of Genesis, he calls it a garden. And so you get a picture of something very, very green, which I am not very good at living into. I've never been a green thumb. I grew in a concrete city. I grew up in Detroit where pavement and concrete was preferred over gardens and dirt and grass. I don't know how to keep things alive that require water and constant attention. And so this idea of a garden as being paradise, as being heaven, is something that didn't apply to me, though I think it might apply to some of you. What applied to me was a city. What I looked for, what I longed for, where I felt comfortable, where I liked to run and play and do life was in these places filled with concrete. These concrete communities with sky rises, with thoroughfares, with boulevards, with business, with commerce, with culture, with communication, with everything gathered together in it. When you look at Scripture, you see that life begins in the Garden of Eden. It begins in a lush paradise. But when you see the fulfillment of all things, when you see this final glimpse of a new earth, of a new heaven, it doesn't look like this lush picture of the garden. It looks like a city descending from the clouds. It looks like the New Jerusalem. And then it goes into description talking about this transformed place. And what binds that place together, its hallmark, is that there'd be no need for light. There'd be no need to illumine anything because everything would be burning bright. Because everything would be filled to overflowing with God's presence. There'd be no way for any darkness to overcome anything because the light of Christ illuminated everything. I think that's what a transformed city looks like. It looks like a city that is so inspired and illumined by the light of Christ that no darkness could ever overcome it. The question is, how do we experience and build a community like that? How do we transform a city to reflect that? And I think in order to do that, we have to ask tough questions about what God is calling us to do and how God calls this specific community to live and to act and to have being. Most people, when they experience Resurrection Downtown, they experience it first through worship. And worship is one of those great eclectic moments where we get to experience God's presence fully, where we remember that God is God, that we are not. We fall down and humbly confess, only to be filled by God's grace through communion, through the bread and the wine, the grace of Jesus Christ, to leave this place. And we're called then to leave this place filled with the light of Christ, so that we would go forth extending worship out into the world, not leaving it here on Sunday. As we gather together for worship, we can't see that as the end. Worship becomes for us in this community the beginning. It's the beginning to a life lived, shining with the light of Christ everywhere it is that we go. Worship should compel us and extend us into the world so that we might go and employ our good works so that others would come to see in us, through those good works, the light of Christ. And when they see it, they should be filled with hope, with resurrection life. with the willingness to trust and to believe that the worst thing isn't the last thing. But there's a reason to go forward, to put one foot in front of the next, and to continue pressing on into the future that God has for them, a future filled with hope. A transformed city looks like a city that is filled with people who see it as their purpose to shine with the light of Christ so much that nothing could ever overcome it, so that the darkness could never prevail, because the light of Christ would so illuminate everything that there'd be no need. And I think that's what this looks like to me. We're called and we're equipped to transform the heart of this city, and that happens when we take worship out into the world. When we extend what we experience here in this place and carry it with us out into the world, so that everywhere it is that we go, we're seeking to serve, to love, to invite, to equip, to befriend all of the strangers in our midst, all of our co-workers at the office, all of our students at school, all of the people that are sitting in the restaurant around us, every person in that coffee shop, every person at First Fridays, every person in that race, every person everywhere it is that we go, we are called to be ambassadors of God's light for them, to live and to love the same way that God lives and loves us first. So a transformed city to me looks like a city that is filled with a group of people who are bold enough, courageous enough to respond to God's grace in such a way that displays it for all the world to see. You might be thinking that's overwhelming, and if you are, that's probably okay, because we get this picture in Revelation of this city descending from the cloud as though it's almost this unreachable, unattainable kind of thing. But I think it's actually attainable. I think it's possible to experience thy kingdom come here on earth just as it is in heaven here in this city. I think it's possible because of this study that came out of a prison in Minnesota. It tried to evaluate what was required in order for an entire culture to transform, for an entire community to change. And so what it did was it measured all of the different prisoners who were in that prison. It measured their involvement in Bible studies as part of disciple groups. And it wanted to see how many people needed to be immersed in the grace of Jesus Christ, to be immersed in this rhythm of living and loving others the same way that God first loves us. How many people needed to be involved in that way before you began to see measured effects throughout the whole system, the whole prison. And what it found over the course of years is that once 15% of the population had experienced the life-changing grace of Jesus Christ and had the willingness to live according to that same grace, to take it out into the world around them, once 15% of the population did that, the whole demeanor of the prison changed. The whole culture of that community was transformed. So what does that look like here? It looks like 15% of the population needs to experience the grace of Jesus Christ, need to have a willingness to gather together, to be filled to overflowing with God's goodness and God's mercy. But then it needs to be filled with the capacity to go forth to share it with the world around them. 15% of the population is approximately 2,800 to 3,200 people. If we experienced a worship where 3,200 people gathered together to experience the grace of Jesus Christ and then committed to go out into the world to share it with their friends, everybody around them, then I think we can experience this new Jerusalem, a different Kansas City, a transformed city. And I think this is what rests at the heart of God's mission for us.